Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. So we're back again. I wanted to take some time to talk about how you distribute your raid cooldowns over the course of an encounter, and what kind of damage you're looking at that constitutes using your raid cooldown, as well as what cooldowns will go well together, which ones will not go well together, and things like that. So, at least for Trial of Valor, you kind of have a number of specific scenarios in which you have a very long encounter. I mean, much like Helia, where you have extremely long encounters that you need to kind of distribute your raid cooldowns over the course of the entire fight, because not only will it save tons of healer mana, because hopefully your healers will not be going and trying to spam as much as possible to themselves in the first 3 minutes, but it can happen sometimes. But I think in fights like Garm, for example, to use Natuvi as another example, it's pretty clear cut where you'll have a big burst of damage and stuff like that from his breaths, and then you're going to have his charge. And because the charge deals so much damage that you end up just stacking cooldowns into one area. One of the simple things for Garm, for example, is Spirit Link Totem is a specific area of effect where it has its power, or it has its effect. So you need to run past Garm, or Garm runs past you once, you run into his old spot, you Spirit Link Totem, he runs past you again and deals all this damage. So that'll be something where you don't really have much of a choice in where you're going to be using it. And you have a lot of flexibility with a number of your other cooldowns, because both all of Revival, Chain Heal, or sorry, Chain Heal Totem, Healing Tide Totem. I mean, Shaman's pretty much Chain Heal anyway. Revival, Healing Tide Totem, Tranquility, all don't have to worry about any kind of healing or standing still for it. Even Aura Mastery for Paladins, if they're running Aura of Mercy, or even if they're running Aura of Sacrifice, they can always just hit that on the move. Or Paladins will have to stand still for Aura of Sacrifice to be spam cast healing or anything like that to get the full effect. So, in many cases, most all the cooldowns, except for Holy Priests, are able to be cast on the move, and you don't really have to worry about too much of that stuff. So if you're in a situation where you do have a Holy Priest, well, then you need to play towards that player's strengths in terms of when they can actually use the cooldown. So, for example, if you're going to be using Trank, Divine Hymn, and then Spirit Link Totem for Garm, what you'll probably start off with doing is you'll probably start off immediately with the Tranquility, and then once you run into Garm's old path, you Spirit Link Totem up, then you Divine Hymn, and then you have your cooldowns, and that should be sufficient. In other situations, and then again, this can kind of vary. In other situations, you may want to be more stingy with your raid cooldowns. So having things like a Symbol of Hope are extremely powerful, or being able to get as stacked as possible for the raid. So you have things like Efflorescence, you have things like Healing Rain, and then generally Light of Dawn and Holy Word Sanctify are all different abilities that require group-bound effects. So having, in lieu of having a raid cooldown or something like that, or if you're not able to allocate one, well, you should at least be stacked, because that'll be most beneficial to your healers in whatever capacity you can do. In general, when you have, going back to like longer fights like Odin or like Helia, you're looking for specific areas where you definitely need a raid cooldown, or you want to be able to use, or you have a specific quota of saying, okay, well, if we want pretty much everyone to be using things twice a fight, on a fight like Odin or Helia, well, you're going to be using them in generally late phase 1 or early phase 2, and to get it again in phase 3. So for Odin, for example, one of the big times to use raid cooldown where it's near required, or even using multiple raid cooldowns, is when you pair up Odin's General Blast, which just blankets the raid, with Himjal's Horn of Valor, because you're getting a big pulse of AoE damage twice on the raid. So even precasting Tranquility, or having your trigger finger on Revival for the first blast of damage to top off that first blast of damage before the second one comes in, things like that will go a long way towards keeping your raid alive. Allocating your innervates properly, of course, is also very, very important, because it is a utility cooldown that can be used by your boomkins. For the purposes of this video and for purposes of reality, I assume every Resta Druid is just going to use their innervate on themselves, which kind of makes sense. But in terms of who else is going to be getting like the Boomkins innervates, more often than not, you'll see monks get it and you'll see disc priests get it. They're generally the ones that are able to consume the most mana for the highest HPS gain possible. So if assuming there's equal skill amongst your raid, because that's another big component of this, you should be giving it to either monks or disc priests. I'm leaning towards disc priests in general because I've seen disc priests do ridiculous things with it, and I've just seen like kind of like a noticeable increase and stuff like that with monks. So I'm leaning a little bit towards disc priests if there's only one, but this also assumes equal skill level. Keep that in mind. If you have somebody who is not performing well, who's playing monk or disc priest, and they're not performing much better even with an innervate, then you're better off giving it to somebody who's going to actually make use of it. So keep that in mind. Assuming equal skill, assuming somebody's actually going to perform, you may want to give it to disc priests. So keep that in mind. In general, there's not too many other really big outside utility cooldowns to worry about, but the biggest thing is how you distribute them over the course of an encounter. So Odin, for example, we kind of all, like when we first did the encounter, it was about 10-minute kill. So we all really spooged our cooldowns early on because we could, and then we kind of distributed them fairly equally over the course of the raid encounter. So we would definitely have we'd have Spirit Link Totem, and then we'd have Revival for the double combo where you would have the Horn of Valor plus Odin's Blast on the raid. So that requires a lot of cooldowns. But in general, if you get into a situation where maybe your raid is going to be falling behind in terms of their overall healing, and what I determined falling behind would be is that all of your healers will be pushed into a situation where they need to cast all of their expensive spells to get everyone into a topped-off period. Well, rather than all those healers spamming all that mana, you're using another raid cooldown. It may not be the absolute perfect time to use it, but it's a lot better than putting all that extra stress on the raid. So, situations where druids can be taking advantage of their 2-minute trank, which I see a lot of druids running these days, is really important because they're able to have that constant effect of stability across the raid. So, keeping that in mind, a lot of times people will push for druids to have the first cooldown because they'll want to be using them as frequently as possible, and it's free. Well, it's mana positive for druids to be doing that because it costs mana up front, but then they're regenerating mana over the course of that whole period, and they're being mobile with it. So. Divine Hymn, of course, I experienced this many, many times where it can be very frustrating to move out of raid mechanics or having to worry about them. So again, playing towards strengths of your healers, where you're saying, okay, well, you're going to find a position where there are no balls flying around, there's no void zones from Helia, there's no dog running at you from Garm, then you're going to pick the situation and then you're going to plan. So if you're a raid leader and you have a Holy Priest on your team, what I would suggest is giving them approximation of when they can use their cooldown and leaving it up to their judgment as, you know, it doesn't have to be 10 seconds after X mechanic happens. It could be 6 or 7 or something, depending on how well they can get into position to succeed. Because it's much better to have a full-length hymn that maybe is not quite where you wanted it than to have one that gets half interrupted or quarter interrupted or something like that because they have to move or because they even die. So keep those in mind. It can be quite difficult to be using Divine Hymn properly, so have some patience with that. It's extremely nice having those other mobile cooldowns and things like that, but I think the deciding factor when you're looking at who to bring to a raid is what is required. So when you have something like Spirit Link Totem, if you can stack, is the most powerful thing possible. You know, it pretty much is the most powerful cooldown in the game because it is just an equalizer effect that is second to none. It's not something that's easily replicated. Where, oh, you could have a druid, you could have revival, you could have holy priest. You know, you could have any of those things, and they do healing, and you have to time them a little bit differently, and they do a little bit different, but it's just raw healing. Whereas an equalizing effect is just so mandatory. Paladins kind of are in that situation where we've sometimes had to run Devotion Aura with our paladin, much to his chagrin, but he ran it anyway. He toughed it up. Where they can be really necessary on things like we needed it early on for Ursoc progression, but later on, you know, of course, he went back to Mercy or Sacrifice. So the nice thing with Paladins, they can be very flexible depending on the needs of the fight. Usually on fights like Odin and on Helia, you see a lot of them using Mercy because Mercy is constantly healing throughout the course of the encounter. And then you see Holy Paladins using things like Sacrifice for shorter encounters where there's a lot of burst. So I've seen it. I'm not actually sure if it's Mercy or Sacrifice for Garm because I've seen a little bit of both. But the fact that when you're taking Sacrifice as a Paladin, you need to push so much healing out that, again, you are going to be immobile as well. So having yourself positioned in that space and in line with the other healers to properly bust out your cooldowns is just so, so important. So positioning matters, the order of healing matters, and getting good uptime out of all the healers' cooldowns really matters because it kind of keep the peace. Because unfortunately, there are going to be many times where healer cooldowns will overlap, or somebody has to hold on to them forever, and that's more or less just an unfortunate situation of how healing is these days. Personal opinion, looking ahead, I would really like to see them make it so that raid cooldowns are something like 5-minute cooldowns, but they're extremely powerful. Because it kind of irks me when, oh, they'll get 3 uses and you get 2 and stuff like that, and it's just kind of a pain. Like it's a pain to deal with, and it's kind of annoying, and I'd rather be in a situation where we don't have to proportion these raid cooldowns here and there and a little bit here, and I would much rather be in a situation where you have won a fight, it can cover a big mechanic, but for the majority of smaller mechanics, you just have to heal through it, because I think that's a better situation where everybody is healing together to stop this damage. And I think that's a much better way of doing it than having a list of mechanics and then a list of the raid cooldowns, just kind of portioning them out together. You know, I think that's kind of silly. But we'll see in the future. If you guys like this video, be sure to share, like, subscribe, etc., etc. Check out the live stream. Hope you all enjoy it, and I'll catch y'all later.